Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture, with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or at the2testaments.com, where you can also donate to support our work. Follow us on Twitter at the2testaments on Facebook or Instagram.
Welcome to the Two Testaments podcast, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Will Kynes.
And I'm Ronnie Cosman.
In this episode, we're looking at Romans 9, 20 to 23, and the metaphor that's used there of God as a potter with Dr. Jason Staples.
Jason Staples is an ancient historian, author, speaker, journalist, voice actor, former American football coach, and a current college football analyst. He is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and I was trying to figure out with Will how to say this as a Canadian. Is it NC State University or North Carolina State?
Yeah, we have all these little nicknames for all of our colleges. You're going to have to pick up on these.
Right. He is the author of The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, a new theory of people, exile, and Israelite identity, which just recently came out with Cambridge University Press. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, Jason is the author of a very interesting article that was just recently published in the Harvard Theological Review, where he discusses the image of God as a potter. And it's a very fascinating article. What's the title of that article, Jason?
The article is Vessels of Wrath and God's Pathos, Potter Clay Imagery in Romans 9, 20 to 23.
Great.
Okay, but before we get into the article, I just have a question for you, Jason. So you played college football, is that right?
Played is a very generous term. I practiced. So if we're talking about my college football career, you can cue Allen Iverson and say, we talking about practice, man. Not the game. Not the game. We talk about practice, man. Practice.
So where did you practice college football?
At Florida State University, which is where I did my my BA and my MA.
Well, it's unfortunate, really. I was afraid you were going to say that. I had this feeling that that's where you played because I'm a huge Gator fan. I'm going back for generations. We're Florida fans. I have my grandfather, my dad, two uncles, and my brother all played for Florida. So we're going to get over that beef, though, and we're going to look at this text. It's going to be okay. So we can talk about college football all day, but that's not what this podcast is about. You've got other podcasts that talk about college football. We're talking about Romans 9, 20 to 23. And I'm interested, first off, to ask you, what attracted you to this particular text? Why did you decide to spend the time and effort to analyze this text in this detailed way?
So this was actually a trajectory that emerged out of my book on Paul, which is coming. It should be released early next year. It'll be called Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. And this is basically a rabbit trail that I found needed to be pulled, a thread that needed to be pulled out, a rabbit trail that needed to be explored a good bit more in detail than I could in the book chapter that I was working on, which was mostly on Romans 9. And basically I wound up, and you've probably had this experience where you wind up writing something and it just keeps growing on the thing that you're writing on. And then you sort of sit back and you're like, I think that's good and interesting and all, but man, that's kind of distracting from the main point I want to make here right now. Mm-hmm. So I ended up cutting it. And then in the process of cutting that, and, I kept, certain parts of it and rewrote certain parts to fit within the chapter. But, in the process of cutting it, I came out with something that I thought worked well as a standalone article.
So now let me read verses 19 through 24. You will say to me then, why then does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who indeed are you, O human being, to argue with God? Will what is molded say to the one who molds it, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one object for special use and another for ordinary use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the objects of wrath that are made for destruction? And what if he has done so in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? including us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. All right, so there's the passage. Jason, how do you see this passage fitting into the book of Romans as a whole? And perhaps how does it relate to what comes before and after?
The main thing that I think is happening here is, first of all, it's a critical part of the larger argument, which I think is not just the argument of Romans 9 to 11, but I think this is central to Romans as a whole, of God's dealing, how God has dealt with Israel and how God has justly dealt with Israel. So there's an element of theodicy of arguing for the specific character of God as just, and specifically just towards his people Israel. And this is something that Paul is heavily invested in, and he wants to explain as a part of the larger argument in Romans. So that's number one, is he's looking at that. Now, the real question then that this is getting at is, if God has been, if large portions, say, of Israel have been hardened like Pharaoh, and then there are people from other nations that are now participating in the promises made to Israel, which is essentially the argument that he's made through the first 8 chapters of Romans, is, look, these Gentiles are receiving the Spirit. This is fulfillment of what the prophets promised. Well, the natural response is, yeah, but the prophets didn't promise it to them. And this is where he kind of comes in and says, okay, so let me step back and explain how this fits into the larger framework of the biblical narrative, as it were, the narrative of Israel, if you prefer, and how God is not actually sort of switching horses midstream. God is staying on the same horse, and he's actually been operating in this way all along. And that's what he does when he starts Romans 9, is he says, look, this is not different from how God has dealt with his people in the past. You go back to Abraham, and Abraham gets the promise to his seed, and it's promised, the promise passes through Isaac and not Ishmael. And then Isaac is the promised seed, the Behor, and he's the rightful heir, and it passes to Jacob and not Esau. God does this. And then, of course, he opens the chapter with an allusion to the golden calf episode, which is, I wish I could be accursed, as it's often translated, on behalf of my kinsmen according to the flesh, which is exactly what Moses does in that moment of the golden calf. And then he wraps that whole thing with the statement that God answers Moses with when Moses stands and intercedes for Israel. He comes in and says, well, this is the answer that God gave Moses, and guess what? That's the answer that God's giving me too. That's the implication, right? This is, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. And then that, so he's basically saying God's operated this way all along. Well, then the next accusation, the natural accusation, is what we have put forward. And he sort of puts it in the mouth of an interlocutor, as it were, where he says, well, then you will say to me, which is interesting, by the way, because it implies that his interlocutor is actually the audience itself. But so here's the next rebuttal is, well, then how is God just? If this is all God's control, if everything's under God's control, then what are we doing?
Right.
Let's just let God do his thing.
Then Israel's lack of response
is God's
ultimately can be attributed to God, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so control of who makes it and who doesn't. Basically.
Yeah. Exactly. And so that's what he's getting at in this, and he wants to explain. Okay, look, this is not how that works exactly. So this passage sort of serves as a bridge between those arguments at the beginning of the chapter about the patriarchs and the Exodus and the pattern about how God works as a whole, to help explain what's happening in the present. And then in the process, as that hinge, it serves as a defense of God's fundamental character and says, no, God in fact is just. So God does exercise choice, but we have to understand how that choice gets made and how God is actually working here with humanity. And that's where this sort of serves as that hinge point within the larger passage. And that's where that question of why does he still find fault for, in the translation that you use there says, for who can resist his will. that's not what that says, right? It's in the perfect who has resisted his will. And that's an important change, which we'll talk about, I'm sure later in this. Yeah. But that's the real question is, okay, look, I mean, are we all just doing whatever? Are we all just automatons doing whatever God says? And this is just basically a sick divine joke? Or is there something else here? And he then puts forward this image as his defense of the image of a just God.
Yeah. And what do you find as the most difficult part of this specific passage here in 20 to 23 to interpret?
So I think the thing that makes this difficult is in large measure the same thing that makes a lot of the Pauline epistles difficult. And that's that it's a really tightly compressed passage. And it actually is, it's got an anakaleuthon. It's got it's ungrammatical in a specific part. And it's kind of hard to relate certain parts together. It's like he just sort of stops his sentence and then moves on to something else. And this happens in speech all the time, and we learn to do it. But,
right.
We learn to deal with it, but it does, in this kind of context, make things a little tricky. The other thing that goes with that is that he's engaging in deep inner biblical exegesis and allusion in this very highly compressed bit. So it's really compressed language that includes allusions and exegesis of multiple biblical passages together. And he's doing all of that, in a bite-sized piece. And then to understand what he's doing here, you basically have to be immersed in and completely fluent in the Old Testament, the other testament in the two testaments, as it were, the Hebrew Bible, that is Paul's Bible. You have to be immersed in that enough to be able to follow what he's doing. I mean, and I think in a lot of respects, reading the Pauline epistles is a lot like reading the Mishnah or Talmud in that respect. I mean, if you're familiar with reading, and your audience, many of your audience has probably never picked up a page of Mishnah or Talmud, and I suggest going and looking some up. It's easy to Google some pages of Mishnah or Talmud, and you'll find that, first of all, it's fascinating material, but second of all, you'll realize, like, oh my gosh, this is just so dense.
Can you just explain Mishnah and Talmud for the audience, what those are?
The Mishnah and the Talmud are two later rabbinic bodies of literature. The Mishnah was codified around 200 BCE, and it's basically an organized set of oral tradition framed together to talk about specific issues and legal interpretations and how to understand the Torah by rabbis who had lived before 200. And then the Talmud is commentary on the Mishnah by rabbis who lived 200
of the Common Era, right?
Yeah, 200 of the Common Era, 200 CE. Yeah. So this is after Paul. And the Talmud is another few hundred years later, about 400 years later, and it's basically commentary from the rabbis who lived and commented on the Mishnah, and they're interacting with its, various debates and engagements and all of that. And you've got layers of material in all of this. And in each case, these are people who are just immersed in Torah, and they know their Bibles backwards and forwards and inside out. And then when they debate one another, they can cite half of one verse along with half of another verse and kind of expect that that their other person that they're talking to, or that the reader is able to follow, that they're actually pulling on elements from each story, and they don't even tag that they're that they're quoting those things.
Right, exactly.
And Paul does the same sort of thing. And I think that's what makes this so difficult, is there's a lot of shorthand, and there's a lot of places in here where he's referencing the material of his Bible in such shorthand that if you don't recognize immediately that, oh, this is this, this is this, this is this, and he's putting them together in this way and sort of stirring it up and presenting you a slightly different picture with all of that mixture, it's going to be really hard to understand what he's doing.
Yeah. Right. Paul, I mean, because the language is compressed, like you said, right? When we talked to Ross Wagner, he said that Paul's language is clipped. That's the phrase he used.
That's a really good way of putting it.
That's exactly right. Is Paul's language and the rationale he uses is not always filled in. And so I think, like Jason said, you have to bring right, a bunch of stuff to the table to fill out what exactly is going on. And this is exactly why we have very different interpretations of this text, because interpreters are trying to piece together and fill in the gaps in Paul's language and logic. And that results in very different kinds of readings of this passage. But Jason, why don't you tell us, what is one way in which the image of the potter and clay here in Romans 9 is maybe most commonly interpreted? I don't know if it's most commonly interpreted this way, but when I'm on campus, like here at Sanford, a lot of my students, one of the theological questions that really presses upon them, for some reason it coincides with people coming to college, this issue, of like fate and freedom, or, Calvinism and Arminianism, sovereignty and free will. What is the image here that is, that the way this is often, how is this image often interpreted?
So before, I'm going to stick a pin in that real quick, because there is actually one other thing to mention in terms of the difficulty of interpretation and why Paul's language is clipped. I think it's important to understand that when he sent these letters, he didn't just send a letter. So, this is important for all of us to remember, is that all of these are designed to be traditioned and read in community. And Paul didn't just send Romans. He sent Romans with Phoebe.
Right.
And Phoebe's, coming, and, her job is then going to be to help explain what's going on when he does this, he's meaning this. And so it then gets taught in this larger context. And so the tradition itself is designed to be, it's a book that's designed to be meditated on in that kind of context and to be discussed. And, this is where this kind of exactly what we're doing is what it's designed to do. So, I think that's really important to remember, is that, Paul could have communicated and, unclipped that language, but first of all, it would have taken a lot more space. And second of all, that's just, they communicated in person, and it was about pursuing God together in person. And the tradition, was much more oral than what we often appreciate.
But that's pointing to another really important point that Jason's making, which is that all interpretation is community interpretation. Right? It always happens in the context of a community. Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast, and we're bringing in a range of different interpreters from different perspectives, so we get to broaden our community of interpretation. Yeah. But Paul is writing in a particular community, and that community has pre-understandings that they bring to a lot of this imagery, and we may not share that. So getting into the way that this is commonly interpreted in a community like the one that Ronnie mentioned here in the Southeast, how do people normally see this?
So the basic, and I think it is the most common, at least these days, way of reading it, and I think it's particularly among those within the sort of Protestant world, where these questions end up being asked much more. I don't think there's quite the same level of obsession with that question in, say, the Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholic communions. I suspect that there's some reasons for that just historically. Paul does kind of have preeminence within the Protestant tradition for a variety of reasons, but yeah, it is a really common thing. And I think within those who are especially focused on it, the primary way of reading this is that Paul basically cites the potter clay passage, not as a rebuttal, not to rebut the idea that God is arbitrary in his decision making, but as a defense that God has a right to arbitrarily make those decisions, and that he basically comes in and says, so who can resist God's will? Well, nobody. And guess what? God has a right to do with you whatever he wants. And if he wants to make you in order to smash you at the end, and in order for you to burn and barbecue in hell for all eternity for his glory, then that's God's prerogative. And you should glorify God for being such an amazing God while you're barbecuing for all eternity, because, wow, look at God's glory. That seems to be the way that this is read as often as not. And I think that doesn't quite get what he's doing in the passage.
Okay. So before we get into some of the like nitty gritty textual, analysis here, give us a brief and kind of like panoramic picture of how you understand the image of the potter and clay at work here.
Well, I think the place to start is actually how I kind of became attuned to this particular passage in this way. And that actually goes back to when I was in my master's work. And I had a roommate who was doing it was either the end of my undergrad or the beginning of my master's. We were roommates for both. And he came home, he was a fine arts guy, and he came home, he had a ceramics class where they had to do a lot of pottery. And he would come home frequently in the afternoon or evening, just completely defeated. Just like, oh man, it was a miserable day. Like the clay just absolutely beat me today. Like I just got my butt kicked. And I would listen to him talk about what it was like to be working with the clay. And of course I'm working on, biblical material, and I'm going, this is starting to sound like Jeremiah, or this is, that might, if I think about it this way, that might actually change a little bit of the way that I understand what's going on in Romans 9, is that the clay has something to do with how the potter's actually working. And so that kind of got my wheels turning. And then when I came through this passage, working on my chapter on Romans 9, I'm going through reading very closely in Greek. And that's where I came across the different terms that I'm essentially challenging the default ways that they're understood, and saying, this isn't actually, like if I'd read this, without knowing any of the English translation, I would not have rendered it this way, because this is not the normal word for this. It's a word for this. So that's kind of how this worked out. And I think the main thing to understand coming in is that when potters are working with clay, when you have someone who shapes clay, and you can, anybody in the audience can go and talk to someone who works with pottery, master potters will all tell you this, that clay is notorious for, first of all, when you put it on the wheel and you spin the wheel, it feels like it's pushing back against you just because of the force that's produced, the force that happens because of the spinning. So it feels like it's pushing against you. So it feels like it's resisting your hand to begin with. And secondly, clay is really temperamental. And the word that comes up over and over and over and over again when you talk to people who work with clay is that clay has a mind of its own. And this is something that in the article, actually, I went through and I pointed to a variety of places where, in tutorials or, different things about pottery, you'd have these master potters be like, well, when you start working with clay, one of the first things you have to figure out is clay has a mind of its own, and you just kind of have to learn to improvise on the fly and work within the constraints that the clay puts you under in order to get what you want out of what you're trying to make. You start with the image in your mind, but you kind of have to work on the fly because the clay is just not going to let you go there naturally.
Right.
And that, I think, once you come into the passage, understanding that part about how clay works and how, a potter works with clay, once you have someone leverage that metaphor and say, well, God works with us like a potter with clay, is going to sound very different immediately. And of course, in the ancient world, potters were all over the place, right? You've got the need for dishes to be made and all these in vessels of all sorts that are being made. And, they're all over the place. And so people would be more familiar with this process than, say, today, where you might go down to Pottery Barn and, buy your dishes for the next, dozen years or whatever. We're just not as familiar with that process as an ancient audience would be, where, odds are a lot of people in Paul's audience would know someone who works with clay.
Right. And we might come to this a little bit later when you talk about clay having a mind of its own. We actually have biblical texts where clay actually does have a mind and mouth of its own, right? So I think we'll circle back to that a little bit later. But let's now get into some of the more focused textual issues. So now I'm going to skip to the ESV now, because you point out that the ESV has translational issues that it concentrates in the way that you don't particularly like, right? So here's the ESV at Romans 9, verse 22. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the objects of wrath prepared for destruction? So let's focus first on this phrase, endured with much patience the objects of wrath prepared for destruction. And there are three aspects of this translation that you question, okay, in light of the image of the clay and the potter. The first one is endured, right, that translation. The second one is objects of wrath and how we take that. And then the third one is prepared for destruction. So let's first begin with endured. You don't like the translation endured, right? Well, tell us what's wrong with endured.
What the verb means is the thing that's in question, and the verb here is the word Pharaoh.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's a word that just generally means to carry or to bear something, to like bear it on your shoulders or whatever, to carry around. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean to endure exactly. Now, you can get sort of metaphorically to the idea of endure, and it works this way in English as well, of I just can't bear it, right? I can't carry this around forever is the idea.
Right.
But that's where these translations are getting the idea of endure, that, he's enduring it, and sort of this, it's metaphorically extending the notion of carrying something around, for a really long time, and, just working with that. Now, the problem is that doesn't exactly get at what the Greek word typically means in this kind of context. So, first of all, I mean, in the context of what Paul's saying here, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say that God is enduring, a vessel. Well, I mean, what would that even mean? I mean, regardless of whatever my wife might say about things, you can't, it doesn't make sense to talk about like enduring a clay jar or, a piece of art or whatever. I just can't take it anymore. Right? Well, like, how are you enduring this clay vessel? Like that
Sure.
That doesn't make sense.
Okay.
So the next thing to do is to say, okay, well, what does Pharaoh mean in this kind of context? And it turns out that in a number of contexts, the word takes on a meaning that's more like produce, which is developing the metaphor of carrying out or bringing out. And we actually get a similar thing again in English with a woman bears children. And in Greek, you have the same kind of context. Philo uses this term for the bearing of children. You have the ground bears plants and plants bear fruit in the same way. So it has to do with the generation or production of something in this kind of almost wombish way, which sort of makes sense given God's self-presentation in Exodus with that same kind of context. But basically in that context, you have, again, Pharaoh is used for the metaphor of production. And I think that's what we have here is something closer to that, where it makes much more sense to talk about a potter carrying or producing vessels than enduring their presence.
Let me ask you, why not carrying? Because I could also imagine a potter carrying, the vessels patiently,
Yeah, you can, and I think I think that's not entirely out of the question, but the issue here is that the image is that the potter is working with clay rather than the fully formed vessels yet.
Okay.
So this is where I think the idea is that the potter has the clay on the wheel and is working with the clay, and in a sense, the potter is carrying the clay. You're working with the clay with your hands. You're forming it. You're producing the vessel by bearing the clay, essentially, at this point. Okay. And so God is working with his hands, in sort of this metaphorical sense, working at the wheel patiently. And what I think happened with a lot of translations is you see that God is doing something with the clay patiently, and you try to figure out how to make Pharaoh kind of work with that. But I think the idea is you have to understand the metaphor first, and then understand what Paul's doing with that. And I think the other thing that sort of is more definitive here is I think it's pretty clear that Paul chose this verb for this context because it's used in Jeremiah 50:25, or the Greek translation of Jeremiah 50 verse 25, which in the Greek version is in 27:25, because you've got, Jeremiah's a little funky that way. But in this case, God brings out his instruments of wrath for the destruction of his enemies. And Paul quotes verbatim that passage. He just cuts off the prefix of the bring out, and now you just have God bears the vessels of his wrath. And I think, again, by cutting off the idea of the bringing out is that God has had these vessels stored up. They're instruments of wrath that he's now going to bring out and use as weapons. Well, in Paul's context, he's actually forming the weapons. And so he just cuts off the prefix, and you get that slightly different meaning, and he works with it. But it's verbatim from what you've got in Jeremiah there.
And that points to the other part of the verse that you're arguing should be reinterpreted, which is the objects of wrath. So explain how you see that.
Yeah, and this is another tricky, very compressed section in this passage. And a lot of scholars have treated this as, and to get a little bit overly complicated here, have treated this as an objective genitive, where you have the of part, the of wrath, is working on the thing that it's of as an object. So you have a vessel that is the object of wrath. And Greek, the genitive can work this way in certain contexts, but it can't here. And the reason that it can't here is because an objective genitive requires a verbal noun in the place where you would have the normal noun that is the noun of something. It needs to be a verbal thing, like the speech of something. Speech is a verbal action. It's an action verb, an action word, even though it's a noun. And here, a vessel is not an action thing. Right. This is, it's not going to work in the objective sense. And beyond that, a vessel of something. I mean, we use this terminology in English all the time, and it works the same way in Greek as in English here. If I said, hey, can you pass me that glass of water? I'm not saying that glass is the object of water.
That it's experiencing water, right?
Yeah, that it's experiencing water. Like, no, the glass isn't experiencing water. The glass is a vessel. It is something that carries water. It has an instrument that, it has an instrumental value that works that way. And I think, again, that's the thing that makes the most sense here, especially, again, given the fact that he's verbatim pulling this phrase from Jeremiah, where it is an instrumental quality, where God is actually bringing out vessels of wrath to destroy God's enemies. They're agents of wrath rather than objects of wrath. Right. And that, I think, is what he's doing here.
Right. Though maybe some of the confusion comes because when you say glass of water, you could also understand that as a glass filled with water. Right. So people are thinking of this as a vessel filled with God's wrath, which starts to bleed over into something like the objective genitive of experiencing God's wrath.
Yeah, and I think that that's a perfectly viable way of taking it. And by the end of the passage, you have the notion, and you see this also in the Hebrew Bible, oftentimes the agent of God's wrath is ultimately consumed by that wrath in the end, right? Okay. Assyria and Babylon are they're the weapons of God's wrath, and then ultimately what happens with them at the end? Well, so I think there's room for that, but the primary sense here is that they are actually agents rather than objects, at least in this part of the verse, and I think that's the point of emphasis.
Right. So the vessel of water inevitably gets wet. And the vessel of wrath inevitably experiences wrath in the end.
Yeah, in some sense, yeah. Yeah, I think that works.
So then we have then in this phrase then, to make known his power has not endured, but has produced with much patience the instruments of his wrath that are made for destruction. So now we're at that third phrase. How would you like to interpret that?
Yeah, and of course in the ESV and a few other translations, this is prepared for destruction, right? This is the NIV as well has prepared for destruction, and I think
that's the purpose they were made for from the beginning, right?
Yeah, that's the idea, is that this is a foreordained state, that these pots, God made these pots so that he could smash them to show how powerful he is.
Right. Kind of like a kid who, builds something and then at the end, gets really excited because now they get to destroy it.
Right. Only the kid is actually doing so in order to show how strong he is.
Right.
So that's the idea. So it's even beyond that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So the first thing I want to highlight is that this word, which is the Greek word katartizo, cannot mean prepared. So just like in English, you have different prefixes that have different meanings and all of this. Greek works the same way, and you can see this in the parallel line where you have the next verse talks about those who have been prepared in advance for God's mercy, right? Mm-hmm. And that word is a word that refers to sort of a pre-planning. And you can see the prefix on that. That's toimasin. And pro is the prefix that you expect for something that is, done in advance, something that's planned in advance. And that's what that word means, is it's planned in advance. And if Paul had meant to talk about these vessels being prepared or planned in advance for destruction, he could have just used the same word, but he doesn't. Mm-hmm. He doesn't use a word that carries this nuance of foreordination. Instead, he uses a word where the prefix is kata, and kata is a prefix that represents something being completed. It's something that happens over time, and it's representing the end of that process rather than talking about the initial plan of that process. And that goes together with then the general use of this word that he uses here in the New Testament generally and outside the New Testament as well, where the word does not mean to prepare something. It's over and over used to represent fixing or repairing or amending or reforming something that is no longer as it should be. So this is the word that's used in the Gospels, for example, when the disciples are mending their nets. Right? Mm-hmm. They're there and, they've gone fishing and, some of the areas of the nets have torn. And what do you do between all of that? You go back and you fix your nets, you mend your nets. Well, that's exactly the word that Paul uses here to talk about what is that they are, made for, or in my preferred, rendering of this is that they are reformed for destruction. And I think the idea here is, again, to leverage the metaphor of the improvisational potter and put that together with this notion of, okay, the end result is this. Well, the potter is working along the way and he's reforming and he's improvising. And this is what he ultimately comes to. This is what he chooses as the final product in the end. And I think that's the sense of this word. It's best understood as reshaped or reformed rather than prepared, because it's not that he's not arguing that God sets out with the idea of, I'm going to make these pots to smash them, but rather he sets out with something in mind and then sort of works improvisationally to produce something that he, the best thing that he can get out of that particular piece of clay.
Right. And this so is yeah, I was just going to say, so this is the main insight, I think, of your article here, is that people generally read this passage and think that what Paul is using the potter metaphor to do is to exalt God's sovereign power, like a potter can just destroy clay if he wants to. But what you're saying is that there's actually a relational nature to a potter's interaction with clay, right? Sometimes the clay has a mind of its own and pushes back, and the potter adjusts to that. And can you fill that out with other passages in the Bible where we see more of this kind of clay imagery used, where there's this relationship with the potter and the clay?
Yeah, and I think the primary place for that is one of the places that Paul himself is pulling on here, and that is Jeremiah 18, which is the sort of center. If you want to talk about God as potter, this is the most extended, the longest, and the most obvious place where that metaphor is applied to God and his people, or God and humanity in the Bible. And so, and Paul, certainly knew this passage and is working with this, and he's already pulling from Jeremiah with another phrase elsewhere. So in Jeremiah 18, Jeremiah is told, get up, go down to the potter's house, and I will I will explain something to you. I will announce something to you. So Jeremiah goes down to the potter, and the passage says, as follows. So I went down to the potter's house, and look, he was making something on the wheel. But the vessel, or the utensil, and again, it's a word that can mean instrument or vessel or whatever, that he was making of clay was spoiled, or became it was not good. It fell to pieces in the hand of the potter. So he remade it into another vessel as he saw fit, as it pleased him to do. Then the word of Adonai, or the word of God, came to me, saying, am I not able, house of Israel, to deal with you in the same way that this potter does? Look, says the Lord, you are like the clay, or like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, house of Israel. At one moment, I might say something concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom, to uproot it, to tear it down, or to destroy it. And if that nation against which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will turn back from the disaster I plan to bring on it. Or at some other time, I might declare concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom that I would build up or plant it. But if it does evil in my sight by not obeying my voice, then I will turn back from the good which I said I would bless it. So then speak to the men of Judah and against the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, this is what the Lord says. And it goes from there, and he declares a prophecy of warning, and he's hoping that they'll heed this, and if they change their ways, then that destruction that's going to come to them is going to be turned back, because God interacts with and amends what he's going to do based on people's response to what he does. And we of course see the same kind of phenomenon in Jonah, right? Where you see Jonah goes in and he prophesies against the city, and they do respond. And right. God relents. He turns back from, he does exactly what Jeremiah says he's going to do. And in the case of Jeremiah, they don't repent. They don't heed his words. And in Jeremiah 19, interestingly, you get another potter and clay passage where, in this case, it's a finished pot. And what is he supposed to do? He takes this out in the sight of all the people who did not heed his words, and he goes and buys an earthenware jar, and you got to wonder whether it's the same jar that was just made in the prior chapter. But he takes some of the elders and the priests, and he goes out into the valley of Ben Hinnom, and at the entrance of the potsherd gate, and gives the words. And what is he supposed to do? He then takes this and he breaks the jar in the sight of the men and shatters it and says, this is what's going to happen to you now. Well, those two chapters together are essentially what Paul's dealing with here. He compresses Jeremiah 18 and 19 down to 2 verses and a few quick phrases, and expects you to kind of follow along with him.
Yeah. I thought that verse 11 of chapter 18, right after you stopped reading, I thought that had a lot of resonance with the way you're understanding the passage in Romans 9, because it says, look, I am a potter shaping evil. And the Hebrew word there, yatsar, is often used for pottery. So like a potter shaping evil against you and devising a plan against you. So now that sounds a little bit like the way people often understand Romans 9. But what's being shaped here is evil, maybe these vessels of wrath. But what is the next line? Turn now, all of you, from your evil way and amend your ways and your doings, right? So the idea here is that the clay will respond in light of this purpose that God has.
Or he hopes, yeah.
Yeah, the whole purpose of this imagery is to try and drive a response, not to say, and it doesn't matter what you do because this was the potter intends.
Right.
Yeah, and of course the next verse is their response of, but they will say, it's hopeless because we're all going to follow our own plans and each of us will persist in the stubbornness of our own, of his evil heart. And you have this, the rebuttal of the people is basically like, well, like we have a real, chance of doing what you're saying here. It's hopeless. And they kind of blame who God made them to be, as it were. You made me this way, and you asking me to change, that's just not the way that this works. And that results in the judgment. It's, they actually essentially they choose the not to have God make any changes, essentially. Right. So this is an engaged, interactive relationship between God and his people.
Yeah, Jason, I have two follow-ups here. One is, so you take the prepared for destruction that basically the vessel is itself going to be destroyed in the end, it sounds like. Is there a way that you could also take this to say, look, it's an instrument of wrath, meaning an instrument that dispenses God's wrath, which I like that reading. And then it's now been prepared responsively, of course. It's now been prepared to execute the destruction. You see, instead of it being destroyed itself. It seemed like in your article you landed on the vessel itself being destroyed, like in Jeremiah 19. Fair enough. But what about this other potential way of reading it? What do you think of that? And if that's a possibility, how would hardened Israel, in Paul's argument, Romans 9-11, be bringing about destruction? Or even if you don't take the last part in the way I suggested, how could hardened Israel be a vessel that brings about God's instrument of wrath? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think your reading is very much within the stream of the text. Going back to Jonah, right? When Jonah preaches against Nineveh, he comes in with the shortest prophecy that you could pretty much ever come in with, right? In terms of prophesying against a nation. And, in most versions, it's, 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown or overturned. So that's, I'm looking at it here. That's a form of hapach or hafach. The form that word takes can mean a couple things. It can mean to be demolished or overthrown, or it can mean to be changed, as in like the heart is altered, that, that Nineveh will repent, as it were. And that actually, by the way, the second meaning is the more common meaning in the Hebrew Bible. So here's the question. Is Jonah proclaiming that Nineveh will be destroyed or that Nineveh will repent?
Mm-hmm.
There's a play. You're suggesting there's a kind of play on words, yeah? Yeah.
And Jonah is basically, he's saying, and you can kind of imagine in the thought world of the prophet within the book, that he's really hoping it's going to be destroyed. Right. But he's basically offering them, you're going to, one way or another, you're going to be overturned. You're going to be changed. You're either going to be transformed, right. You're going to be changed in this way, or you're going to be overthrown. And I think that's the same sort of thing that Paul does here. Paul loves his wordplay. He loves leaving these kinds of double options open.
Okay.
And I think he leaves this open of, okay, So if we're the potter, or if we're the clay and God's the potter, and God's working with us and he's forming us this way to be agents of his wrath and so on, just like what Jeremiah says.
Which presumably, I should say, for Israel to be vessels of God's wrath could mean to be agents bringing about his justice and judgment.
Bingo. Yeah. Bingo.
Right.
So now, the injustice of the nations is taken care of by the agents of wrath that God has designed to do this. And that's, of course, their function in Jeremiah when God brings out his agents of wrath, as instruments of wrath. So that's one option, right? If you submit to his hand, here's going to be the function. Here's going to be the way that this is going to work. And the destruction that you bring about will not be your destruction. But if you do not submit to his hand, then the destruction that you walk into is going to be your destruction. And it's your call on which one it's going to be, because God is is going to bring about destruction. Which side of that ledger you fall on is going to be completely contingent on whether you submit to his hand or not. And I think that double, the fact that you're saying, like, this could be read either way, like, which one is it? I think that's exactly the point. I think that's exactly how Paul tends to write. I think he leaves that option. He puts it into the passage to say, okay, so how are we going to respond to God's hand?
Okay. Let me follow up with another question. I've typically read the whole God takes out of the same lump, or out of one lump. What is it in verse 21? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one object for special use and another for ordinary use? I've typically read it as, so he has this one lump, and then out of that one lump, he takes some of the clay and makes a vessel, for ordinary use, and a vessel, for special use. But could it be in light of what's going on with Jeremiah? And I don't know if this is what are you suggesting this, or is this possible? That no, it's the same one lump of clay can be made into ordinary use, or can be made into a vessel of wrath, but then can be repurposed into another vessel.
I hadn't thought about it.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think I think that's a viable reading. I had not actually considered that particular reading, but just off the cuff, that isn't out of the question, I don't think. I mean, the way I read it was that he's kind of pinching off parts of the given lump to make into different things, but but I think, again, that's one of those things where you could potentially read it the other way, and I think, again, my suspicion is that Paul would go, yeah, exactly. It could work that way too. Right. So, I mean, he's starting with the lump, and just like in Jeremiah, it works this way. And with each piece that he might pinch off of that one lump of clay, each piece is going through that same process. So, I think that's kind of the idea within the passage.
Jason, how does the potter clay metaphor here illuminate Paul's language about Pharaoh when he says that God hardens, hardening language, hardens the heart of whomever he chooses in verse 18?
And again, I think that's a great question. I think that question is what sets up the potter clay metaphor, because the word that he uses for hardening here, skleruno, is a word that makes a lot of sense, and it's used in the context of pottery. Because what do you do when you finish the forming of clay? You take it and you bake it in the oven to harden it in its final state. So the judgment of Pharaoh is not that Pharaoh is specifically formed into this from the beginning. The judgment is that God does not show additional mercy in continuing to form Pharaoh into something else, like wrestling with Pharaoh. Pharaoh's maybe resisting God's hand, and now, God, is showing great patience, and finally, like, okay, well, I'm going to force you into something that you're not. The judgment of hardening is that God leaves you as you are. That, okay, this pot's done. And once the pot's done, then it's fired, it's hardened, and it's not going to change anymore. The image here is that as long as the clay is wet, as long as the clay remains pliable in God's hands, then God is continuing to show mercy in shaping and forming that clay. And the mercy is that Israel, in the golden calf episode and other things like that, they put themselves in a position where they could be right then and there, cut off and hardened in their state, and that's it. But God continues. The mercy that God shows is, no, I'm going to keep forming. I'm going to form until Israel is what I'm wanting them to be as a people. Now, interestingly, the individuals that do that, all of those individuals die in the wilderness. So they don't actually participate in, they to some extent individually get hardened, but the people God continues to show mercy to. So I think that's the idea of hardening that Paul is engaging with across this passage. And it sets up this notion of how God works in the sense of clay.
So, Jason, to finish off our discussion of the passage, let's come back full circle, as you do in the article, with the question that Paul raises. So, who has resisted his will? What answer does Paul expect us to give here?
Yeah, this is really important because most translations are going to take this as who resists his will or who can resist his will, which is actually, Paul is quoting a couple of Old Testament, and actually there's a section in Wisdom that has this as well in the Apocrypha. This question of, who can resist or who resists God's will. Paul alters that phrase just a little bit to the perfect, who has resisted his will. And that's a different kind of question than who can. This is a question of it's an empirical question, right? Has anybody ever resisted God's will? And of course, if you know the narrative, the biblical narrative, on the one hand, you're instinctively going to answer, well, no one can resist God's will. But if you know the biblical narrative, you know that the biblical narrative is basically it's all about humans flagrantly and repeatedly resisting God's will. I mean, this is what Israel does. Like, it's the history of Israel is God tells them do this, and Israel's like, nah, we're going to do this other thing. And then God's like, oh, come on. No, okay, I'm going to discipline you this way, and I'm going to send you prophets. And, maybe you get a little bit of work in another direction, but then more disobedience. And it's over and over and over again, this flagrant disobedience of God. And so this is sort of Paul's answer to say, who has resisted God's will? We have, guys. Like, that's kind of been our thing.
Interesting. Yeah. Great. Well, let's finish up the way that we like to on the Two Testaments podcast and ask our guest for a blurb. So something that you could recommend to our listeners, and it doesn't have to be a book. I know academics love to recommend books, but it could be anything, a movie, a TV show, a life hack, anything that you have recently come across and you think others might enjoy.
That's a good question. I think one thing that a lot of your listeners may find useful is, and actually I'm going to give two that are almost three things, is there's a YouTube channel called Aleph with Beth. That is it's a sort of immersive introduction to biblical Hebrew. And it's
great.
It's been done so well by these folks who are down in Mexico, but basically everything they're going step by step, introducing you to the basics of biblical Hebrew. And if you go through this, you actually, if you've had biblical Hebrew before, can help refresh certain things. If you haven't, it actually does start to stick with you. I mean, my toddlers have been loving these videos and are now asking me certain questions about biblical Hebrew that sometimes I don't remember. So, and they've got a partner channel called Aleph with Angela now, or Alpha with Angela now, which is they're doing the same thing with biblical Greek, where it's basically a free resource that you can just sit down with and immerse yourself a little bit in biblical Hebrew. And they've got it where they've got songs, they've got, biblical stories that you're following along with, on there with the words on the screen, and then images, and you're getting a chance to actually hear it and see it and do this on the regular. I think that's really useful. I'll just go ahead and leave it at that. I think that's a really worthwhile thing that, like I said, my toddlers in particular have been having a lot of fun with.
Great. So Aleph with Beth on YouTube, which is a genius title. If your name is Beth. It's a great blurb. Thanks, Jason.
Well, Jason, thanks for taking the time and to walk us through your argument and reading of Romans 9, verses 20 through 23. It was very fascinating. And thank you, listener, who hopefully you have chosen and you have responded like a willing clay, not resisting, to tune into the two testaments. And if you have loved being a clay, responding to the two testaments, if you would go onto Apple Podcast, you can give us your best 5-star rating. That would be much appreciated. And you can also find us on our website at thetwotestaments.com, where you can subscribe and find previous episodes on Romans. Thank you.
The Two Testaments is produced with support from Samford University, where Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes are professors in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. Thanks to you, our fellow travelers, who support this journey by donating on our website, thetwotestaments.com. Thanks also to Cam Thomas, Joe Zelder, and the team in the Samford Faculty Success Center, and our student assistants for their help with production, editing, and promotion.